All right, today we're talking about triangle congruence. So what it means for triangles to be congruent. So triangles are congruent if they have the exact same sides and the exact same angles, meaning it has sides that are the same length and angles that are the same measure. So if I look at number 1, it says identify the corresponding congruent sides and angles. Write a congruent statement for the triangles. So we're going to find the corresponding sides and angles first. So I'm going to start off with the sides. If you notice, there's these markings on all of the sides and they have different amounts. So I'm going to start off with the ones that have one dash on them. We call those tick marks. So if you notice that this side and this side have exactly one tick mark. So I could say side US is congruent to segment, and then we could say LN. So notice the segments have that little straight line above it, and this congruence symbol tells me they're exactly the same length. So a congruent symbol just has a squiggle with an equals underneath it. Okay. So if I continue on and I look, we'll look at ones that have 2 dashes. So I can say side SW is congruent to side NQ. So then the last one would be the ones that have 3 markings. So if I look, I can say side, we could say WU is congruent to side QL. So these are my 3 corresponding sides that are equal to each other, that are congruent. So I'm going to move on to angles. So if you notice, in each angle in the triangle, there's like a different marking. So if you look in this one triangle, U has 1 arc and L has 1 arc. So that means that angle, so this is the symbol for angle, angle U is congruent to angle L. If I look at angle S, there's 2 arcs, and N, there's these 2 arcs, so this would be angle S is congruent to angle N. And so for the last one, I can say, okay, if I look, this is W has 3 of these arcs and Q has 3, so angle W is congruent to angle Q. So since all of the sides are the exact same length and all of the angles are the exact same length, I can write what's called a congruent statement. So a congruent statement tells me which triangles and which corresponding parts are congruent. So if I wrote triangle, USW is congruent to, well, we can't just write any 3 letters in the second triangle. The corresponding pieces have to match up. So if you notice, L goes with U, so I know that I could say L, and then which angle goes with S in the second triangle? You should see N. And then the last triangle, W, goes with Q. So this is an example of a congruent statement. There's actually a few other ways you can write this, but as long as the corresponding pieces are matching up, we are good to go. So if you notice, I can look and see US is congruent to LN just by looking at the position here. Okay? If you notice that SW, that's the second and the last letter, do you see how that matches up with NQ? And then the last one, WU, so if I look the last letter and the first letter, that does match up with QL. So this is an acceptable congruency statement because all of the angles are with its corresponding parts and same with all of the sides. Okay, well this gets kind of tedious to write out every single side and every single angle. So there are a few shortcuts when we're talking about congruent triangles. So if you have all three corresponding sides congruent, that's enough to say the triangles are congruent. So if you look here, I have one set of congruent sides, I have another set of congruent sides, and I have a third set. So we have all three corresponding sides congruent. So these are congruent by side, side, side. Okay, so this is my first shortcut. So if you have three congruent sides, that's enough to say the triangles are congruent. In the second one, so we need to have two sides and the angle between them congruent. They call that the included angle. So if you notice, I have one side, set of sides congruent. I have another set of sides congruent. And then the last criteria is the angle between those two sides are congruent. So the angle has to be in between those two sides in order to be congruent by side, angle, side. The last one we're going to talk about, and there's more than this, but these are the only three we're going to cover, are it's angle, side, angle. So what this says is if I have two angles and the side between them, that's enough to say that the triangles are congruent. So if you notice here, I have one side and the angles, it says I have two angles and the side is between them. So if you look here, I have an angle here. The side is in between them, and then I have an angle here. So this is angle, side, angle. Okay? So if I go back up top, all three sides, that's enough to say the triangles are congruent. If you have sides and the angle between them, that's enough to say that the triangles are congruent. And the last one is if I have two angles and the side is in between those two angles, that's enough to say that the triangles are congruent. Okay? So we're going to be using those shortcuts to kind of help us determine if triangles are congruent or not. So look at number 2. It says determine which congruent statement, if any, can be used to show that triangle PQR and STU are congruent. Well, let's look at what the markings tell us. I have one set of congruent sides. I have another set of congruent sides. And I have one more set of congruent sides. So since I have three corresponding sides, three matching sides in each triangle congruent, this is enough to say the triangles are congruent. So we could say this is yes because of side, side, side. We can abbreviate that SSS. And then it says we want to write a congruent statement so the matching parts are easy to identify. So I'm going to start off with triangle PQR is congruent to triangle. Well, if you notice, it's PQR, so that would be STU. So that is my final answer. Okay, so if I look at number 3, it says determine which congruent statement, if any, can be used to show that triangle ABC and DEF are congruent. So let's highlight what we have here. I have one set of congruent sides. I have another set of congruent sides. And if you notice, I have an angle that is in between those two congruent sides. If the angle was over here, do you notice how that's not touching that purple and that orange highlighter line? It's got to be in between. So this is an example of side. Angle is in between side. So are the triangles congruent? Yes. And we can abbreviate that SAS, side, angle, side. So if you just want to write SAS, I know what you're referencing. Side, angle, side. So now it says show that triangle ABC and DEF. So we did. So let's write a congruency statement. So I could say triangle ABC. So if I look, A is the angle with the arc on it, BC, so I'm starting here, here, here. So that would be congruent to triangle. So I would do the same in this triangle, so that would be DEF. And that would be it. Okay, so that's an example of side, angle, side. So the last two do not have pictures. So my suggestion is to draw them always. So for number 4, it says determine which congruent statement, if any, can be used to show that triangle HIJ and triangle KLM are congruent. And then it tells me HI is congruent to KL, angle H is congruent to angle K, and angle I is congruent to angle L. So that's these 3 criteria we're going to have to mark on our pictures. So you can draw 2 triangles. It doesn't matter which way they look, but I feel like it's easiest to draw 2 triangles that look like these acute triangles. Okay, so if you notice, it said the first triangle is H, so I'm going to start here, I, J. And the second triangle is K, L, M. Okay, so now I'm going to do the markings that they told us. They said HI is congruent to KL. So this is a side. You mark all sides with those dashes. So I'm going to just put 1 dash on HI and 1 dash on HL. Or excuse me, KL. All right, the next one is an angle. Those angles you always mark with arcs. So angle H, so I'm going to put an arc, is congruent to angle K. So I'll put another arc on K. So notice I have 1 arc on each angle. And then the last one says angle I. So I can't use 1 arc because I already did that. So I'm going to have to do 2 arcs here. It's congruent to angle L. So is this enough to say the triangles are congruent? Well, do I have side, side, side? Nope, I don't have all 3 sides. Do I have 2 sides on it and an angle? No. But it looks like here I have 2 angles. Angle. Let me put that A inside here. And if you notice, the side is in between them. So this is an example of angle, side, angle. So I could say triangle HIJ is congruent to triangle. So if I started with H, I should start with KLM. LM. And the reason why is because of angle, side angle. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for number 5. We're going to draw a picture. So it says determine which congruent statement, if any, can be used to show that triangle PQR and STU are congruent if segment PQ is congruent to segment ST, segment PR is congruent to segment SU, and angle Q is congruent to angle T. Alright, so like we did before, let's start off with 2 pictures of triangles. They don't have to be super large pictures. You just want them to look roughly the same size. But it's a sketch, so it's okay if it's not. So if you look, it tells me 3 criteria. First, it says PQ, segment PQ, is congruent to ST. So the first thing I'm going to have to do is label this picture. So this is triangle PQR. Well, if I started with P in the lower corner, I'm going to start with S and then go up top to T and then U. So if I look, PQ is congruent to ST. Remember, that's a segment, so you're going to have those dashes, those tick marks on either side. So it tells me that those sides are congruent. And then it says PR is congruent to SU. So I'm going to put 2 tick marks on either side, on PR and SU. And then the last thing tells me that angle Q is congruent to angle T. Remember, you put arcs on the angles. So if I look here, I have a set of sides. I have another set of sides, and then I have an angle. So is this enough to say that the triangles are congruent? Well, do you notice how if I was to name this, it would be SSA. There is no such thing as side-side angle. If the angle was in between the two, we would be good to go because that would be side angle side. But it's not. It's not in between the two sides. So there is no such thing as side-side angle. So these triangles are not congruent. So remember the shortcuts. 3 sides congruent, that's side, side, side. If you have 2 sides and an angle and the angle's between the sides, that's side, angle, side. And then if you have 2 angles and a side in between, that's angle, side, angle. So you gotta know those 3 shortcuts. All right, have a great day.